The massive chamber of the Galactic Council stretched for nearly a kilometer in every direction, with crystalline walls that shifted colors based on the emotional states of the thousands gathered inside. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the human delegation podium, his uniform pressed and perfect, his hands steady despite the weight of what this moment meant for his entire species. Behind him stood Admiral Lisa Carter, Earth's most experienced diplomat, and beside her were 3 translators who had served the Council faithfully for 5 years. The youngest translator, Amy Rodriguez, was only 23 years old and had learned 6 alien languages to help bridge the gap between humanity and the stars. Jake looked out across the assembly floor where representatives from 53 different species sat in their designated sections. Some breathed oxygen like humans, others floated in tanks of liquid methane, and still others existed as pure energy contained in crystalline matrices. This was the heart of galactic civilization, the place where disputes were settled and laws were made, and today humanity was asking for something they had wanted for 20 years since first contact. They wanted to be recognized as full members of this ancient institution. The presentation had gone well, or so Jake thought. He had shown holographic displays of Earth's contributions to galactic society over the past 2 decades. Human engineers had helped repair damaged stations after the Cortex Plague. Human doctors had developed vaccines that saved millions on the Outer Rim colonies. Human artists had created works that now hung in museums across a dozen worlds. Humanity had followed every rule, paid every fee, and respected every custom while waiting patiently for this day. Then the Zithek delegation requested permission to speak. Prime Minister Vextar rose from his seat in the reptilian section of the chamber. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his scales gleaming like polished emeralds under the ambient light, his eyes cold and calculating as they fixed on Jake. The Zithek had been part of the Council for over 1,000 years and controlled 12 systems with an iron fist. They were warriors, conquerors, and they believed that might made right in all situations throughout the universe. Vextar's voice boomed through the chamber without need for amplification because his species had evolved to project sound across vast distances. He began by questioning every achievement Jake had presented, twisting humanitarian aid into espionage, and calling peaceful trade agreements proof of human expansionist tendencies. But his real attack came when he began discussing human history, playing footage from Earth's databases that showed ancient humans hunting animals across the plains of Africa. "Look at them," Vextar said with a laugh that echoed off the crystalline walls. These primitive persistence hunters who would chase their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They think this barbaric behavior makes them fit for civilized space. They are predators wearing the mask of diplomacy, dangerous animals that cannot be trusted among peaceful species. The chamber erupted in discussion as various delegations argued among themselves. Jake wanted to respond, but protocol required him to wait until called upon by Council Speaker Morden, an ancient insectoid who had held his position for 300 years and rarely showed emotion of any kind. The minutes dragged on as species after species voiced their concerns about humanity. The ethereal collective spoke through their quantum communicator about how humans displayed disturbing levels of curiosity that made them unpredictable neighbors. The silicon-based Christech mentioned human mining operations that never stopped until every resource was extracted regardless of environmental concerns. Even species that had positive relationships with humanity seemed hesitant to fully endorse membership because of fears about what humans might become with full council privileges. Admiral Carter stepped forward when finally given permission to speak. She was 70 years old and had spent half her life in service to Earth's diplomatic corps, negotiating treaties and resolving conflicts without ever losing her composure. Her voice was steady as she addressed the Council's concerns, explaining how humanity had evolved beyond their hunter-gatherer origins and now embraced cooperation over competition. But Vextar interrupted her, which was a serious breach of protocol that Morden chose not to punish. The Zithek Prime Minister laughed again, a sound that made the translators beside Jake visibly uncomfortable. "These humans believe they can hunt anything," Vextar declared loudly enough for every being in the chamber to hear. "Let them try to hunt the Void Stalkers in the dead nebula if they are so persistent. Let them chase shadows through dimensions if they think their primitive instincts make them special." The chamber filled with laughter from dozens of species who found the comparison amusing. The idea that humans might be dangerous seemed ridiculous to beings who had mastered faster-than-light travel thousands of years before Earth discovered fire. Humanity was new, inexperienced, and despite their contributions, they remained outsiders in a galaxy that had been civilized longer than humans had existed. Council Speaker Mordun called for a vote on humanity's membership application. The process took less than 5 minutes because the outcome was never really in doubt. 50 species voted against membership while 3 abstained and none voted in favor. The rejection was absolute and humiliating, broadcast live to every human settlement across dozens of worlds. But the council was not finished with humanity. Mordun announced new trade restrictions citing security concerns about human expansionist tendencies, effectively isolating Earth and her colonies from most galactic commerce. The restrictions would cost billions and set back human development by decades, but there was no appeal process and no way to challenge the decision. Jake felt the weight of failure pressing down on him as he prepared to leave the podium. 20 years of effort, countless hours of negotiation, all the hope that humanity had placed in this moment, destroyed in less than an hour. Admiral Carter placed a hand on his shoulder, her face showing the same disappointment he felt, but then something happened that changed everything. Vextar descended from his delegation area and approached the human podium with 6 armed guards flanking him. He stopped directly in front of Amy Rodriguez and the other 2 translators, all of whom had served the Zithek delegation personally for years. The young woman had learned the complex Zithek language with its 17 different tenses and had never once made an error in translation. During official proceedings, these humans have been in our presence for years, Vextar announced to the chamber. They have heard our private discussions and learned our customs. They are potential spies who could use their knowledge against us. This is what happens to those who threaten Zithek security. Before Jake could move or Admiral Carter could protest, Vextar signaled his guards. 3 energy weapons fired simultaneously, and the human translators were vaporized instantly, their bodies converted to ash that scattered across the polished floor. Amy Rodriguez had been smiling just seconds before, proud to serve her species in such an important capacity, and now she was gone along with her colleagues. The chamber fell silent except for the sound of Vextar laughing. Several other Zithek delegates joined in, their voices creating a horrible chorus that echoed through the massive space. Some species looked uncomfortable with what had just occurred, but none spoke out against it. Council Speaker Mordun observed the scene without comment, his ancient eyes revealing nothing about his thoughts on the matter. Jake stood frozen at the podium, his hands gripping the edges so hard his knuckles turned white. He had served in Earth's military for 15 years before joining the diplomatic corps, had seen combat on 3 different worlds during the colony wars, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. These were civilians, non-combatants who had committed no crime except learning languages and helping their species communicate with the stars. Admiral Carter's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady as she filed an official protest with the council secretariat. The response came within minutes in the form of a brief message stating that the Zithek had acted within their rights as a sovereign species and the matter was considered closed. The Zithek delegation departed the chamber still laughing, their guards casually stepping over the ashes of the people they had just murdered. Other delegations began filing out as well, most avoiding eye contact with the remaining humans. The session was over and there was nothing more to discuss. Jake helped Admiral Carter gather their materials, while maintenance drones arrived, to clean the floor where 3 human beings had stood moments before. Only Council Speaker Mordun remained in his elevated position, watching the humans prepare to leave. Jake met the ancient insectoid's gaze for just a moment and thought he saw something that might have been concern or perhaps regret. But Mordun said nothing and eventually turned away. The human delegation left Nexus Prime 6 hours later aboard a small diplomatic shuttle. None of them spoke during the journey back to human space. Jake sat in the passenger compartment staring at the stars outside the viewport, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. Amy Rodriguez had been excited about this assignment, had talked about how diplomacy was the future of humanity, how understanding between species was the only path forward. Admiral Carter broke the silence. The news spread across human space like fire through dry grass, reaching every colony and station within 72 hours of the incident. Amy Rodriguez had family on Mars, the other two translators had children waiting for them on Europa Station, and now those families would never see their loved ones again. The footage from the council chamber was played on every news network, showing the moment when Vextar ordered the executions and the sound of Zythek laughter that followed. Humanity watched in collective horror and rage as their people were murdered for entertainment while the galaxy did nothing. Earth's official government filed formal protests through every diplomatic channel available, demanding justice and accountability for the deaths of innocent civilians. The Galactic Council responded with form letters stating that the Zythek had acted within their sovereign rights, and the matter was closed to further discussion. Trade restrictions remained in place, and humanity's status as outsiders was reinforced by the silence from species that had previously called themselves friends. General Ryan Brooks sat in his office deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, watching the footage for the 100th time. He was 60 years old and had spent his entire adult life in Earth's Defense Force, rising through the ranks during the colony wars and the Outer Rim conflicts. His office walls were covered with commendations and photographs of soldiers who had served under his command. But none of that mattered anymore because the enemy had changed. Brooks began making encrypted calls to people scattered across human space, reaching out to commanders and strategists he had worked with for decades. Within a week, he had assembled a group of 20 individuals in a secure facility that officially did not exist on any government records. They represented military intelligence, special operations, xenobiology research, and information warfare capabilities that Earth had been developing since first contact with alien species. Dr. Helen Murphy was the first to present her findings to the assembled group. She had been studying the Zythek for 8 years, learning their language and culture while working as a civilian researcher at the Xenobiology Institute on Luna. Her presentation covered everything from Zythek biology to their social structure, and the picture she painted was both detailed and disturbing in its implications for any conflict. The Zythek Empire controlled 12 star systems with a total population of approximately 40 billion individuals spread across dozens of worlds and hundreds of stations. Their society was rigidly hierarchical with a ruling caste that numbered only about 2 million individuals who controlled all political and military power. These elites were bred on 3 sacred worlds where genetic purity was maintained through carefully controlled reproduction programs that had been running for thousands of years. Commander Pete Williams listened carefully to Murphy's presentation before offering his own assessment of the tactical situation. He had led special operations teams on 17 different worlds and specialized in asymmetric warfare against superior forces. His conclusion was simple and terrifying in its directness. Humanity could not win a conventional war against the Zythek Empire, but they did not need to fight that kind of war. Williams proposed what he called Operation Persistence, a systematic campaign to eliminate the Zythek ruling caste using humanity's natural advantages. Humans could blend into alien populations better than most species because of their adaptability and patience. Humans could learn languages and customs quickly, while maintaining deep cover for years if necessary. Most importantly, humans had a persistence that other species found disturbing because they would pursue objectives across decades without losing focus or determination. Casey Johnson took over the presentation to outline the information warfare component of the operation. She was 32 years old and had been hacking alien computer systems since humanity first gained access to galactic networks. Her team had already penetrated Zythek communication systems at multiple levels, gathering intelligence on ship movements, military deployments, and government operations that would take years to fully analyze. Johnson explained that every Zythek ship, station, and significant installation had been mapped and tagged with current information about security systems and personnel. Her teams were monitoring financial transactions, military communications, and even personal messages between Zythek officials to build comprehensive profiles of every individual in the ruling caste. The amount of data was staggering, but human computers were more than capable of processing it all. General Brooks let the presentations conclude before asking the question that everyone in the room was thinking about. Could they really hunt down and eliminate 2 million individuals scattered across 12 star systems without triggering a full-scale war that would destroy humanity? The answer came from an unexpected source when Jake Morrison entered, the room still wearing his diplomatic uniform. Jake had not been invited to the meeting, but Brooks had left word that he would be welcome if he chose to come. The young captain looked older than he had a week ago, the weight of what he witnessed at the council showing in his eyes. He spoke quietly, but everyone in the room heard every word he said about how the galaxy had judged humanity. They had been rejected not because they were unworthy, but because they were different, because they represented something that made the established powers uncomfortable. The Zythek had murdered their people to demonstrate strength, and the council had allowed it because humanity did not matter in the grand scheme of galactic politics. Every species in that chamber had seen what happened, and none had spoken out because humans were expendable. Jake continued speaking about how Earth's government would never approve a military operation against the Zythek because it would mean war with a superior force. But what if the operation was not sanctioned by any government? What if it was the choice of free individuals acting on their own authority to protect their species from those who would destroy them without consequence? The room fell silent as everyone understood what he was proposing. Brooks made the decision that would change galactic history within the next hour. Operation Persistence would proceed, but not as an official Earth military action. Instead, it would be coordinated by a distributed network of cells operating independently across human space and beyond. They would call themselves the Pack, a reference to humanity's ancient hunting groups that worked together to bring down prey much larger than themselves. The Pack would have no central authority that could be negotiated with or destroyed by enemy action. Each cell would operate independently with access to shared intelligence and resources, but complete autonomy in how they pursued their objectives. If one cell was discovered and eliminated, the others would continue without interruption. The Zythek would be facing an enemy that could not be defeated by conventional means because there was no army to destroy or capital to conquer. Recruitment began immediately through encrypted networks that connected military veterans, intelligence operatives, and civilians who had lost family to Zythek attacks. The response was overwhelming as thousands of humans volunteered to join the hunt, offering their skills and their lives to pursue justice for Amy Rodriguez and the others who had been murdered. Within a month, the Pack had operational cells on 40 different worlds, including several in Zythek-controlled space. Meanwhile, the Zythek Empire continued its campaign of aggression against human frontier settlements. Fexter had interpreted the Council's silence as approval for more extreme actions, ordering raids on colony worlds that resulted in hundreds of human deaths and thousands taken as slaves. Each attack was broadcast on Zythek Entertainment, networks where civilians watched human suffering as a form of recreation that celebrated their species' superiority. Every raid only strengthened human resolve and brought more volunteers to the Pack. Families who lost members to Zythek attacks did not turn to Earth's government for help because they knew no help would come through official channels. Instead, they turned to the networks that promised action and revenge, offering information and resources to the hunting cells that were forming across human space. Dr. Murphy spent weeks training Pack operatives in Zythek language and customs, teaching them how to move through alien spaces without drawing attention. Commander Williams ran intensive courses on infiltration and assassination techniques, adapted for operations on worlds with different gravity and atmospheric conditions. Casey Johnson created secure communication protocols that allowed cells to share intelligence without revealing their locations or identities to anyone, including each other. The first Pack operation was launched 3 months after the Council massacre and targeted a Zythek diplomatic convoy traveling through neutral space. The convoy consisted of 5 warships escorting a luxury transport carrying the Zythek ambassador to the Crystalline Compact, along with his staff and family. Pack intelligence indicated that the ambassador's brother was among the security detail and was directly involved in planning raids on human colonies. Human operatives had modified 3 civilian cargo ships to appear completely normal while hiding compartments filled with weapons and equipment. They approached the Zythek convoy in a busy shipping lane, where dozens of other vessels traveled peacefully. When the Zythek warships ordered the cargo ship, 2 years had passed since the convoy attack, and the galaxy had learned to speak of humans in whispers. The Pack had become something that parents used to frighten children in a dozen different species, a story about relentless hunters who could appear anywhere and vanish like smoke. Ambassador Carl Davis stood before the Galactic Council, trying to maintain Earth's official position while everyone in the chamber knew that humans were systematically destroying the Zythek ruling, cast with methodical precision that terrified even species who had no love for the reptilian empire. Carl was 55 years old and had replaced Admiral Carter as Earth's senior diplomat when she retired, to spend time with her daughter. He was a skilled negotiator who had worked on trade agreements with 17 different species, but his current assignment was impossible because he had to publicly condemn actions that every human privately celebrated. The council members watched him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to fear, wondering if Earth could truly control its own people or if humanity had become something entirely new. The numbers that General Thexmore presented to the council were staggering in their implications for galactic security. Over 3,000 Zethek officials and military officers had been eliminated in 2 years by human operatives working across 40 different worlds. The pack had demonstrated capabilities that no intelligence agency had predicted, including the ability to maintain deep cover operatives who lived for years within Zythek society, learning languages and customs until they were indistinguishable from native citizens. Thexmore was one of the few surviving members of the original Zythek military command, and his scales had lost their shine from the stress of trying to protect his species from an enemy he could not fight. He showed footage of attack sites where human operatives had struck with surgical precision, killing their targets without harming civilians or causing collateral damage that might justify military retaliation. The pack was following rules of engagement that made them impossible to condemn under galactic law while making them absolutely lethal to anyone they decided to hunt. The most disturbing aspect of human operations was their patience. Thexmore explained how some targets had been stalked for months by operatives who worked normal jobs and lived normal lives while gathering intelligence about security patterns and personal habits. When the moment came to strike, these operatives would eliminate their target and vanish completely, often leaving behind evidence that the death was an accident or natural occurrence. Only pack signature marks at each scene confirmed that humans were responsible. Council Speaker Morden convened an emergency session to discuss the human situation, and the chamber filled with representatives from every member species. The ancient insectoid had been speaking less in recent sessions, watching the unfolding crisis with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall over 3 centuries. His opening statement acknowledged what everyone already knew. Humanity had become a threat unlike anything the Council had faced in its 1,000-year history. The debate that followed revealed deep divisions among galactic species about how to respond. The Corthan Collective argued for immediate military action against human space, claiming that allowing vigilante justice to continue would destroy the legal framework that held civilization together. The Ethereals spoke through quantum communications about their fear that humanity represented an evolutionary dead end for sapient species, a regression to primitive hunting behaviors that other races had evolved beyond. But not every species agreed that humans were the problem. The Crystalline Compact pointed out that the Zythek had murdered innocent translators without provocation and then laughed about it in front of the assembled galaxy. The Peaceful Alliance representatives noted that Zythek raids on human settlements had killed over 2,000 civilians and enslaved 5,000 more before the pack operations began. Several smaller species privately expressed satisfaction that someone was finally standing up to Zythek aggression that had threatened them for generations. Kylene represented the Compassionate Alliance, a coalition of species dedicated to peaceful resolution of conflicts through understanding and dialogue. Her people had studied both humans and Zythek extensively over the past 2 years, trying to understand the dynamics that had led to this crisis. She addressed the council with a warning that made several delegates visibly uncomfortable. Kylene explained that what humanity was doing was not a war in any traditional sense because wars had objectives that could be negotiated or compromised. The pack was conducting an extermination campaign disguised as justice, systematically eliminating everyone connected to the original massacre and subsequent attacks on human populations. Her species had analyzed human biology and history, discovering that persistence hunting was encoded in their very DNA as a survival strategy that had made them dominant on their homeworld. The truly terrifying part of Kylene's analysis was her prediction that the pack would not stop until they achieved complete satisfaction regardless of how long it took. Humans had tracked prey animals across entire continents on Earth for weeks at a time, using their unique ability to sweat for cooling while running their targets into exhaustion. They had applied this same persistence to space exploration, to scientific research, to every challenge their species had faced, and now they were applying it to hunting those who had wronged them. Ambassador Davis tried to respond to the Council's concerns, but his words rang hollow because everyone knew the truth. Earth's government had no control over the pack cells operating across the galaxy, and no real desire to stop them, even if such control was possible. He offered platitudes about working with Council security forces to identify and arrest human operatives, but no humans had been captured alive in 2 years of operations despite the best efforts of multiple species intelligence agencies. The pack had become something unprecedented in galactic history. A distributed network of operatives with no central command structure, no fixed bases that could be attacked, and no political leadership that could be pressured or eliminated. They operated using compartmentalized cells that knew nothing about each other beyond shared intelligence databases, maintained through quantum encrypted networks that even the most advanced species could not penetrate. Ghost was the name whispered across human space as the coordinator of pack operations, though no one knew if Ghost was an individual or a committee or an artificial intelligence created specifically for this purpose. Messages from Ghost appeared on secure channels with new targeting information and operational guidelines, but attempts to trace these transmissions led nowhere because they bounced through relay stations scattered across 100 different worlds. Pack operations had evolved beyond simple assassinations into sophisticated campaigns that struck at the very foundations of Zythek society. One particularly audacious raid targeted a military research facility on a moon orbiting the Zythek homeworld, a location that should have been impossible for humans to reach without being detected. Pack operatives had infiltrated the facility months earlier as maintenance workers and scientists, learning the security systems and earning the trust of their Zythek colleagues before striking. The raid resulted in the deaths of 47 researchers working on weapon systems designed specifically to counter human tactics. More importantly, the pack retrieved data containing the names and locations of every Zythek official involved in planning attacks on human settlements over the past decade. This information was distributed to every pack cell within hours, providing targets for operations that would continue for years. The most dramatic demonstration of human capabilities came during an operation on Zythek Prime 7, one of the 3 sacred breeding worlds where the ruling caste reproduced under carefully controlled conditions. Security on these worlds was absolute, with orbital defense platforms and ground forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Zythek believed these worlds were untouchable, protected by layers of defense that no enemy could penetrate. Pack operatives had been living on Prime 7 for 18 months, working as teachers, doctors, technicians, and in dozens of other civilian roles that gave them access to the breeding compounds. They had learned the complex social rituals and genetic selection processes, earning positions of trust within Zythek society while waiting for orders that would put their carefully constructed covers at risk. The operation commenced on a night when most of the planet's security forces were focused on celebrations marking 1,000 years since the founding of the breeding program. Pack cells activated simultaneously across 12 different compounds, moving through buildings they had mapped in exhaustive detail. Every government official present for the ceremonies was eliminated with precision that spoke to months of planning and perfect intelligence about who would be where. The operatives then vanished into the civilian population, discarding their weapons and returning to their normal lives as if nothing had happened. By the time Zythek security forces understood what had occurred, over 200 members of the ruling caste were dead, including several who were direct descendants of Prime Minister Vextar. The pack left their signature mark at each site, a small card printed with the names of the 3 murdered Trey. 5 years had transformed the galaxy in ways that no one could have predicted when the Zythek laughed at human persistence. The once mighty empire now existed only as scattered populations living in refugee camps and heavily guarded compounds. Their government collapsed and their military disbanded after losing every officer above the rank of captain to pack operations. Elder statesman Frank Morrison sat in his office on Earth, watching reports from across known space, understanding that his species had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Frank was Jake's father and had served Earth's government for 40 years in various diplomatic roles before being named to his current position as senior negotiator. He was 73 years old and had hoped to retire to a quiet life with his grandchildren. But instead he found himself managing the most complex political situation humanity had ever faced. The Zethek were effectively finished as a species, and the galaxy was demanding answers about what humans intended to do next. The Zethek population had been reduced from 40 billion to less than 2 million individuals scattered across a dozen worlds, under the protection of other species, who feared they might be next if they refused. The ruling caste that had once numbered 2 million now consisted of perhaps 300 survivors who lived in constant terror, knowing that human operatives could be anyone around them. Pack operations had been so thorough that some Zethek bloodlines had been completely eliminated, their genetic material erased from existence. Council Emergency Coordinator. Veltar had been appointed specifically to deal with the human situation, and he worked tirelessly to organize some kind of intervention that might save what remained of the Zethek species. He was a member of the Korthan species, tall and graceful with crystalline structures growing from his shoulders that glowed with emotional intensity. The light from those crystals had been flickering red with stress for months as he tried to coordinate a response that every species seemed reluctant to support. The political situation was complicated by the fact that many species privately celebrated Zethek downfall, even while publicly expressing concern about human methods. The Zethek had been aggressive neighbors for centuries, conducting raids and demanding tribute from smaller species who lacked the military power to resist. Now those same species were watching their tormentors being systematically destroyed by humans, who asked for nothing in return except that the galaxy stay out of their way. Yixara was one of the few surviving Zethek nobles, and she had decided to make a desperate attempt at ending the hunt before her species was completely extinct. She was young by Zethek standards at only 40 years old, and she had spent the past 5 years watching her family and friends disappear one by one to human assassins who struck without warning. Her scales had turned pale from stress and fear, her movements careful because she knew that death could come at any moment. She traveled to Earth under heavy guard provided by the Compassionate Alliance, bringing with her evidence of her authority to negotiate on behalf of her species. The journey took 3 weeks through multiple jump points and security checkpoints, every moment filled with terror that pack operatives might strike before she reached her destination. When her ship finally landed at Earth's primary diplomatic facility, she felt relief mixed with dread about what would happen next. Frank Morrison agreed to meet with Yixara in a conference room that was broadcast live to every major network across human space and the broader galaxy. The Zethek noble entered carrying a sealed container that security scans confirmed contained biological material, preserved in stasis fields. She placed the container on the table between them before speaking in perfect English that she had learned specifically for this meeting. The container held the heads of the 3 guards, who had executed the human translators 5 years earlier, preserved exactly as they had been at the moment of death. Yixara explained that she had spent 2 years tracking down these individuals through Zethek military records, finding them hiding in remote settlements where they thought themselves safe from human vengeance. She had personally overseen their execution and brought their remains to Earth as proof of her sincerity. Yixara's proposal was simple and desperate in its directness. Her species would accept any punishment Earth deemed appropriate if the hunting stopped immediately. The remaining Zethek would submit to human authority, pay reparations for every civilian killed or enslaved, and dismantle what little remained of their military and government structures. She spoke of children who had done nothing wrong, of ordinary citizens who had never supported the attacks on humans, begging for mercy that she knew humans had no reason to grant. Frank Morrison listened without interruption, while millions of humans watched the broadcast from their homes and ships across dozens of worlds. When Yixara finished speaking, the silence stretched for nearly a minute before Frank began his response. His voice was measured and calm but carried an edge that made clear he was not speaking for himself alone, but for every human who had lost someone to Zethek aggression. Frank acknowledged Yixara's efforts to bring the guilty parties to justice but explained that the 3 guards were only the most visible perpetrators of a crime that went far deeper. Prime Minister Vextar had ordered the executions, but hundreds of other officials had supported him and thousands more had celebrated when it happened. The raids on human settlements had involved tens of thousands of Zythek military personnel who had killed civilians and enslaved families for profit and entertainment. The elder statesman continued by addressing the core issue that made negotiation impossible. The pack had never been sanctioned by Earth's government and operated as a distributed network of free individuals who had decided that the Zythek represented an existential threat to human survival. These operatives could not be recalled or commanded because they answered to no authority except their own sense of justice and their determination to protect their species from future attacks. Frank explained that Earth's government had tried to control the pack in the early months of operations, issuing statements condemning vigilante violence and promising to prosecute anyone who participated in illegal activities. But prosecutions had never materialized because no evidence could be found linking specific individuals to specific attacks. And public support for the pack was so overwhelming that any government action would have triggered political crisis. The broadcast continued with Frank describing humanity's perspective on what had happened 5 years earlier. Humans had come to the Galactic Council seeking friendship and cooperation, offering the best of what their species could contribute to galactic civilization. They had been rejected and humiliated, then forced to watch as their innocent translators were murdered for entertainment while the galaxy laughed and did nothing. Every attack on human settlements after that moment had reinforced the lesson that humanity's only choice was to protect themselves because no one else would stand up for them. The pack had formed not as a military organization but as a survival response, using capabilities that humans had developed over millions of years of evolution to eliminate threats that conventional forces could not address. This was what humans did when pushed too far. They hunted until the threat was eliminated completely. Yixara tried to argue that the remaining Zythek posed no threat to anyone, that they were refugees who wanted only to survive and rebuild some small fraction of what their empire had been. Frank's response was brutal in its honesty. The Zythek had proven themselves incapable of peaceful coexistence with other species, and their cultural values emphasized strength over mercy. Even if the current generation learned humility, future generations might decide to seek revenge for their losses. The meeting ended without agreement or compromise because there was nothing to negotiate. Yixara left Earth knowing that her mission had failed, and that her species would continue dying until the pack decided they had killed enough. The broadcast sparked debates across human space about whether the hunt should continue, but polls showed that over 80% of humans believed the operation should proceed until complete justice was achieved. Wolf commanded pack field operations from a mobile headquarters that moved through human space using encrypted jump coordinates that changed daily. He was one of the original operatives trained by Commander Pete Williams, and had risen to leadership through years of successful missions that demonstrated both tactical brilliance and absolute commitment to pack objectives. His teams were preparing for final phase operations that would determine whether the Zythek survived as a species. The final phase targeted the remaining breeding populations on the 2 sacred worlds that still maintained genetic repositories and birthing facilities. Pack intelligence indicated that approximately 2,000 Zythek were gathered on these worlds, under heavy guard provided by the Galactic Council Protection Fleet. The fleet consisted of over 300 warships from 24 species, representing the most significant military force assembled in decades. Council Emergency Coordinator Veltar had personally overseen deployment of the protection fleet, believing that such overwhelming force would deter human operations. His species had never fought a war and did not understand military tactics beyond basic theory, but 10 years had passed since the day the Galactic Council laughed at human persistence and the galaxy had become a fundamentally different place. Dr. Kevin Walsh sat in his university office on Mars surrounded by data files and interview recordings, working on the most comprehensive study of the Zythek extinction ever attempted. He was a military historian who had spent the past decade documenting every aspect of what humanity had done, creating a record that would serve as both warning and testament to the power of human determination. The numbers in Walsh's research were staggering when laid out in their full context. The pack had conducted operations across 147 different worlds over the course of nearly 10 years, eliminating 47,000 Zythek officials, military leaders, and government functionaries without losing a single operative to capture. The operational security had been absolute because pack cells used compartmentalized intelligence and autonomous decision-making that made the entire network impossible to penetrate or destroy. The remaining Zithek population numbered approximately 2 million individuals scattered across refugee settlements on 30 different worlds. They lived under assumed identities with populations that barely tolerated their presence, knowing that any aggression might trigger a resumption of pack operations that had officially ended 2 years earlier. The proud empire that had controlled 12 systems and commanded fleets that numbered in the thousands now existed as a diaspora of broken survivors who taught their children to never speak of the old days. The Galactic Council chambers were quieter than they had been in centuries, as new council speaker Zarmoth called the assembly to order for a special session, marking the 10th anniversary of the Translator Massacre. Zarmoth had replaced Morden after the ancient insectoid finally retired following the Zythek crisis, and the new speaker had made it his mission to ensure that the lessons learned were never forgotten by any species in the galaxy. The empty chair where the Zythek delegation had once sat remained as a memorial to what happened when a species underestimated human nature. Zarmoth was a member of the silicon-based Christek species, and his body glowed with patterns that reflected his emotional state during important moments. Today those patterns showed respect mixed with lingering fear as he prepared to address the assembled representatives. Zarmoth's speech was broadcast across every major network, reaching billions of individuals on thousands of worlds. He began by recounting the events of 10 years earlier, when humanity had come to the council seeking membership and offering friendship. The Christek speaker showed footage from that day, reminding everyone how the Zythek had mocked human persistence and called them primitive hunters unfit for civilized space. The speech continued with details about what happened next, how Prime Minister Vextar had ordered the execution of 3 human translators as a demonstration of strength, and how the galaxy had watched without intervening. Zarmoth spoke of the raids on human settlements that followed, of families killed and enslaved while the council debated whether to impose sanctions that never materialized. He explained how humanity had tried every diplomatic avenue before finally resorting to methods that no one had predicted. Zarmoth described the pack operations with clinical precision, noting how humans had infiltrated Zythek society at every level and maintained deep cover operatives for years while gathering intelligence. He spoke of human patience that allowed them to track targets across decades, of adaptability that let them blend into any culture, and of persistence that meant they never stopped hunting until objectives were achieved. The galaxy had called humans primitive, but their hunting methods were the most sophisticated that any species had ever developed. The council speaker's voice carried warning as he reached the conclusion of his address. Humanity had tried to join galactic civilization peacefully, and had been rejected with violence and mockery. They had shown the galaxy what happened when their people were murdered for entertainment, when their colonies were attacked without consequence, when justice was denied through official channels. Every species needed to understand that humans were indeed persistence hunters, but on a scale that made traditional warfare obsolete. Zarmoth finished his speech with words that would be quoted for generations across known space. Humans were not to be trifled with because they never forgot injustice and never stopped hunting those who wronged them. The Zythek had learned this lesson too late and paid the ultimate price for their arrogance. Any species that threatened humanity should remember the empty, share and understand that the same fate awaited anyone who made the mistake of underestimating human determination. The council voted unanimously to grant humanity full membership with all privileges and protections that status entailed. Trade restrictions were permanently lifted, and formal apologies were issued by every species that had supported the original rejection. Several smaller species that had suffered under Zythek aggression requested formal alliances with Earth, hoping that human protection might deter other aggressive neighbors from following the same path. Nicole Carter stood at the human delegation podium, accepting the membership on behalf of her species. She was 32 years old and had grown up during the decade of pack operations, watching her mother, Admiral Lisa Carter, coordinate intelligence operations while maintaining official deniability. Nicole had chosen diplomacy as her career, specifically because she wanted to prevent future conflicts from escalating to the point where hunting became necessary. Nicole's acceptance speech was brief and carefully worded to acknowledge the Council's decision while reminding everyone of the cost that had been paid to reach this moment. She spoke of Amy Rodriguez and the other translators who died because they believed in building bridges between species. She mentioned the thousands of humans killed in Zythek raids and the trauma that still affected survivors living in frontier settlements. Her message was clear. Humanity wanted peace but would never again allow their people to be murdered without consequence. The speech concluded with Nicole outlining humanity's vision for their role in galactic society. Humans would offer their technology and expertise freely to species that sought cooperation. They would mediate disputes and protect smaller species from aggression by larger powers. Most importantly, they would demonstrate that persistence and determination could be used for building rather than destroying, for creating rather than hunting. Ranger sat on the porch of his small house on a frontier world watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. He was 58 years old now, and had spent the past 2 years trying to adjust to civilian life after a decade of pack operations that had taken him across 40 different worlds. His hands still remembered how to assemble weapons in darkness, and his mind still mapped exit routes from every building he entered. But he was learning to live without the constant tension of being a hunter. The journals Ranger kept during his pack service filled an entire cabinet in his study, thousands of pages documenting operations that would never be made public, because operational security remained critical even after hunting had stopped. He wrote about targets he had tracked for months, about the moment of decision when eliminating someone became necessary, about the weight of taking lives even when those lives belonged to individuals who had committed terrible crimes. Some entries in Ranger's journals questioned whether the pack had gone too far in their pursuit of justice. He wrote about Zythek families destroyed because one member had participated in raids decades earlier, about children who grew up without parents because humans had decided their bloodline was too dangerous to survive. The moral complexity of what the pack had done would be debated by philosophers and historians for generations, but Ranger knew that every operative had struggled with the same questions during quiet moments between missions. Other entries celebrated the effectiveness of human methods and the satisfaction of achieving objectives that conventional military forces could never have accomplished. Ranger described the pride he felt working with operatives who had mastered alien languages perfectly, who had integrated so completely into foreign cultures that even other humans could not identify them, who had demonstrated patience that other species found incomprehensible. The pack had been humanity's answer to a problem that diplomacy could not solve, and they had succeeded beyond what anyone thought possible. Dr. Kevin Walsh completed his research study with a chapter titled The Warning Unheeded that analyzed why the Zythek had failed to understand the threat humanity represented. His conclusion was that species who evolved as prey animals or who developed civilization without significant predation pressures could not intuitively grasp what persistence hunting meant at a fundamental level. The Zythek saw humans as primitive because they used methods from humanity's ancient past, not understanding that those methods had been refined and adapted over millions of years to become the most effective hunting strategy nature had ever produced. Walsh's research included disturbing observations about pack cells that had never officially disbanded after operations concluded. His interviews with government officials and intelligence analysts revealed that scattered operatives remained embedded in populations across Dawsey,